March 24th, 2010. In a quiet Florida trailer park, a young woman walked through a door she thought would bring peace. But what waited inside didn't look like peace at all. It didn't look befitting for a 19-year-old who still had her whole life ahead of her. Something was off. Something didn't fit. And within minutes, that sense would explode into violence we would never forget. Her name was Audreanna Zimmerman. Gentle, determined, a daughter who wanted to heal others, a student chasing her dreams. That's who she was. And that's who everyone who loved her knew her to be. She should have walked out of that trailer with plans for tomorrow. Instead, tomorrow would never come. Because later, when the truth emerged, it left a burning question behind. Why would a mother, her teenage daughter, and their neighbor turn on Audreanna with such ferocity? And why did detectives say they had never seen violence like this? Tonight, we retrace every step to find out. At 19, the world feels wide open. You're old enough to imagine the future, but still young enough to believe it can be anything you want it to be. That was where Audreanna Zimmerman stood in 2010. She was just 19, a daughter, a student, a young woman building her life step by step. She wasn't perfect, she wasn't finished, but she was alive with plans. She dreamed of becoming a nurse, a choice that spoke as much to who she was as it did to where she wanted to go. Audreanna wasn't chasing titles. She wasn't reaching for wealth or prestige. Nursing for her meant something simpler, something deeper, helping people when they were at their lowest. That was the kind of person she was. Friends remembered her laughter, the kind that wasn't forced, the kind that carried warmth into a room and reminded people that even in the middle of hardship, there was still light. Her smile reached her eyes, and when she listened, she gave you her full attention. She wasn't the loudest voice in the group, but she was the one people trusted. To her cousins, she was dependable. To her friends, she was loyal. To her mother, she was the hope that better days were ahead. Her mother described her as her pride. Not because Audreanna had already achieved everything she set out to do, but because she was trying. Every morning she got up, she studied, she helped around the house, and she looked ahead instead of behind. 19 is an age of in-between. You're still someone's child, but you're also building toward independence. It's fragile ground, and for many, it's uncertain. But her mother could see how hard she was working, how much she wanted to create a life she could stand on. That's why she called her pride. That's why she saw her daughter as the one who would make it further than she ever had. Life in the Zimmerman household wasn't glamorous, but it was filled with love. They lived in a modest trailer park in Florida. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, where neighbors waved when you walked past, and children played near the street. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. There was stability in routine, safety in family, and comfort in familiarity. But in a community that close, privacy was rare, and whispers could grow louder than truth. Arguments could spill across yards, and grudges had a way of holding on long after they should have faded. That was the backdrop of Audreanna's life. Still, she kept her focus on what mattered. She wanted to graduate. She wanted to get her nursing license. She wanted to work hard, earn her place, and give back. She wasn't searching for shortcuts, and she wasn't searching for trouble. She was chasing a simple dream: stability, security, a future that was steady. To her, that meant everything. Her friends remembered the little things. The way she carried her books tucked under her arm, the way she stayed up late studying, the way she laughed at her own mistakes. Her cousins remembered the way she showed up, the way she made even ordinary moments feel brighter. Her mother remembered her presence in the kitchen, her laughter at the dinner table, her quiet promises that she would make her proud. These were the details that defined her life. Small things, ordinary things. But together, they painted the picture of a young woman standing at the beginning of everything. And that is what makes her story so unbearable to hear. Because we know she didn't get to finish what she started. While she was dreaming of a career, someone else was dreaming of revenge. While she was holding on to hope, others were holding on to anger. While she wanted to heal lives, others wanted to break hers apart. She was at the beginning, but the ending was already being written for her, and it was nothing like the future she imagined. And the question remains, who were they? And how close will they be to her? Think of the contrast. A girl studying at her kitchen table, writing reminders about her next exam, laughing with her mother, sketching out what tomorrow could look like. Just a few doors away, resentment was spreading. Whispers were sharpening. Plans were forming. Two worlds, one filled with beginnings, one filled with bitterness, existed side by side. Audreanna thought she was moving forward. She never saw how close the darkness was, waiting to pull her back. That's why her life matters. Not because she had already changed the world, but because she was in the middle of building it. She was still learning, still reaching, still dreaming. And she should have had time. She should have had the chance to wear those scrubs, to stand in that hospital, to live the life she promised her mother she would build. But she never got there. That's the heartbreak of her story. Her future was stolen before she could ever live it. Audreanna wanted to heal lives. She never knew her own life would need saving from the people closest to her. If you were Audreanna's mother, watching your 19-year-old daughter working hard, planning her future, and promising to make you proud, how would you feel, knowing that neighbors she trusted would later be the ones to take her life away? Share your thoughts in the comments, because Audreanna's story isn't just about what happened to her. It's about the choices we all face when anger turns into hate. We also want to extend our thanks for your amazing support. This channel succeeds because of viewers like you. And you can also join our YouTube membership today to unlock exclusive perks, enjoy premium content, and help us keep creating the stories you love. Before the night of March 24, 2010, before the fire and the screams and detectives whispering they had never seen such violence, there was a feud. A feud that began like so many others, with pride, jealousy, and betrayal. To understand how a 19-year-old nursing student's life was torn away, you have to look at the people around her, and how a teenage dispute grew into something no one thought possible. Every person in this story has a role, and every role matters. The first name is Brittany Miller, 16 years old. She was a teenager trying to hold on to her relationship, a relationship that meant more to her pride than anything else. At 16, love feels permanent, even when adults know it rarely lasts. For Brittany, it wasn't just about affection, it was about control, about saving face in a community where everyone was watching. And in her mind, someone had stepped across a line that could not be ignored. That someone was Audreanna Zimmerman. She was only 3 years older than Brittany, but those 3 years meant everything. They meant she was old enough to be independent, to make her own choices, to chase her own future. When whispers began to spread that she had been caught with Brittany's boyfriend, the entire balance shifted. In a place where gossip could echo louder than truth, the rumor didn't just bruise Brittany, it humiliated her. To her, it wasn't simply a boyfriend being unfaithful. It was betrayal made public, a mark against her pride. And standing behind Brittany was her mother, Tina Brown. Tina wasn't just a bystander. She wasn't just a parent offering quiet advice. She was furious. She saw the affair, or even the accusation of it, not only as teenage drama, but as an insult that struck at her family's dignity. In her eyes, Audreanna had crossed a line that could not be crossed back. Tina was not a quiet woman. Neighbors knew her as someone who didn't back down easily, someone who made her voice known. And now, with her daughter's pride on the line, she wasn't going to let this go. Then there was Heather Lee, a neighbor in the trailer park. She wasn't family, but she was close enough to Tina and Brittany to be drawn into the conflict. She was older than Brittany, but younger than Tina, living on the edge of both worlds, and loyalty mattered to her. When the arguments began, Heather leaned to Tina's side, listening, agreeing, and eventually helping to carry out what would come next. Now, to the spark that set the feud ablaze. It wasn't just whispers. There was confrontation. When Brittany confronted Audreanna, the argument turned fast. Words flew, harsh, sharp, and humiliating. In the middle of it all, Audreanna reached for what she had, a stun gun, and she used it. She shocked Brittany, not to humiliate her, but to protect herself in a heated moment where voices had turned into threats, and threats had turned into aggression. For Audreanna, it was courage. She stood up for herself in a fight she hadn't wanted, but had been pulled into. For Brittany, it was humiliation layered on top of betrayal. For Tina, hearing her daughter had been shocked was the final strike. It wasn't just a feud anymore, it was war. That confrontation split everything wide open. Audreanna had defended herself and shown she wouldn't be bullied, but in doing so, she gave Tina and Brittany a wound they wouldn't stop scratching. To them, the fight wasn't over. It was only the beginning. They replayed it in their heads. They retold it to neighbors. Every time it was told, it grew larger, sharper, angrier, and as the days passed, resentment hardened into something mysterious. Think of the courage it took for a 19-year-old girl to stand her ground, to show strength in the middle of a storm that could have swallowed her. But think also of how quickly courage can make you enemies. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't looking for violence. But she wasn't going to let herself be attacked either. That moment of defiance, that act of self-protection, became the reason they wanted her destroyed. In Tina Brown's eyes, her daughter had been assaulted. In Brittany's eyes, her pride had been burned to ash. And in Heather Lee's mind, standing beside them meant loyalty, no matter the cost. Forgiveness wasn't an option. Letting it go was impossible. Instead, they replayed the affair, the confrontation, and the shock of the stun gun until their anger hardened into hate. That is how the line was crossed. What should have been a teenage feud, words shouted, tempers flaring, and time cooling it down, grew into something else. Because this wasn't just a 16-year-old girl nursing a broken pride. This was a mother pouring gasoline on her daughter's resentment. And when adults fuel the hate of children, the fire doesn't burn out. It consumes everything in its path. Audreanna thought she could move forward. She thought the fight was behind her. She returned to her studies, to her laughter, to her mother's hope. She believed that courage had bought her space. She believed that pride and anger would cool. But in the trailer park around her, it wasn't cooling. It was building. She was making plans for her future, while others were making plans to erase it. That's the contrast at the heart of this story. On one side, a 19-year-old girl sitting at a kitchen table, scribbling notes for exams, promising her mother she'd finish what she started. On the other side, a mother and daughter, seething, plotting, feeding each other's rage until it became something too dangerous to ignore. What began as a teenage feud would fester until it grew into something unimaginably violent. But the question we have to sit with now is this: what happens when adults fuel the hate of children? And here is where I want you to step into the story. Being in Audreanna's shoes, 19 years old, accused of an affair, confronted, and forced to defend yourself against people who already hated you, what would you have done? Would you have fought back the same way, or walked away and hoped it would end? Tell me in the comments, because Audreanna's story isn't just about what happened to her. It's about the choices we all face when anger and pride cross a line. March 24th, 2010. It was a Wednesday night in Ensley, Florida. The trailer park was quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear neighbors' televisions through thin walls and the occasional bark of a dog down the street. For most people, it was just another night. For 19-year-old Audreanna Redon Zimmerman, it was a chance to finally put an end to weeks of tension. The call had come from Tina Brown, the mother of 16-year-old Brittany Miller, the girl who had been at the center of every whisper and every glare since the confrontation weeks earlier. Tina reached out and told Audreanna she wanted to talk. She wanted to smooth things over. She wanted to end the back and forth that had taken over their lives. To Audreanna, it sounded like a door opening. Maybe peace was possible. Maybe all the anger was finally cooling down. For Audreanna, 19 meant she had more to lose than to gain by holding onto a feud with a teenager. She had exams to study for, family who counted on her, and a future to build. She had told her mother she wanted to move forward. She didn't want the fight to define her. and she didn't want her name dragged through the park anymore. So when Tina Brown called, Audreanna agreed. She believed reconciliation was possible. She believed Tina wanted the same thing. But Tina didn't want peace. Tina wanted something else. Behind her invitation was a plan already set. She wasn't alone in this. Her daughter Brittany was there, still furious, still humiliated, still carrying the sting of the stun gun that Audreanna had used to defend herself. Their neighbor, Heather Lee, was there too. 3 people, all connected by resentment, had gathered for one purpose. They weren't waiting to talk. They weren't waiting to listen. They were waiting to strike. And that is what makes this moment so tragic. On one side of the street was a young woman holding on to hope, believing that maybe words could be enough to heal what had been broken. On the other side was a group of predators who had already decided that words weren't enough. They wanted her pain. Audreanna left her home with no sense of fear. If she had been afraid, she would have stayed. If she had known what was waiting, she never would have gone. She walked with the innocence of someone who still believed in second chances. She wanted resolution. She wanted the weight lifted. She thought she was walking into a truce. She was really walking into a trap. This wasn't strangers pulling her into danger. This was a neighbor's home, a familiar place, people she knew, people she had spoken to countless times before. That familiarity was the disguise. That was what made the betrayal so cruel. Inside, Tina, Brittany, and Heather were waiting. They had already decided what the night would look like. To them, reconciliation was never on the table. Audreanna believed there might be laughter again, that maybe they could return to normal, that maybe the fighting could end. But the others didn't want laughter. They wanted screams. They didn't want forgiveness. They wanted her destroyed. This is where betrayal cuts deepest. Because betrayal never comes from strangers. It comes from people who know your name, who share your space, who smile at you even when they're planning your pain. That night, betrayal had 3 faces: a mother, a daughter, and a neighbor. And for Audreanna, the trap was already closing. It's easy to imagine her sitting down, maybe still trying to find the right words, maybe still believing the tension could break with an apology. But apologies weren't enough for them. To Tina and Brittany, humiliation had to be repaid with suffering. To Heather, siding with them was loyalty, no matter the cost. There was no peace waiting in that room, only violence. This is where we pause, because the audience already knows what is coming. Yet at this moment, Audreanna didn't know. She couldn't know. She walked into that trailer with hope. They met her with hate. That's the loop that holds us. She thought she was walking into a truce. She was really walking into a trap. And that leaves us with the question that haunts this story still. What does betrayal look like when it wears the face of friendship? That same night that started with hope ended in horror. 19-year-old Audreanna Redon Zimmerman stepped into Tina Brown's trailer, believing the weight of weeks of anger was about to be lifted. She thought maybe an apology, maybe a handshake, maybe some words would put it all to rest. But what she found was no conversation. It was an ambush. The door had barely closed before the tone changed. Audreanna might have felt it. The tension in the room, the way eyes locked onto her, the silence too heavy for peace. Before she had time to ask a question, the attack began. The first sound was sharp, electric, unmistakable. The crackle of a stun gun. It lit up the air. It lit up her body. She had used a stun gun herself weeks earlier in self-defense, and now it was being used against her. That sound, that sudden jolt, announced the beginning of something she could never escape. She screamed, her body tensed. The voltage ripped through her, dropping her defenses instantly, but they weren't finished. Before she could recover, the crowbar came down. Heavy, merciless, swung with force that didn't just want to stop her, it wanted to break her, metal against flesh, over and over again. The blows came without hesitation, without mercy, with a fury that made clear this wasn't just about ending her life, it was about making her suffer. This wasn't quick, this wasn't clean, this was personal. Every swing of that crowbar, every crackle of that stun gun, every strike of fists and feet spoke of hatred far beyond an argument between teenagers. It spoke of anger that had been fed, watered, and grown until it exploded. They didn't just want her gone. They wanted her erased. They wanted her to feel every second of betrayal before the final moment came. Inside that trailer, she must have been confused. Seconds earlier, she had thought she was walking into reconciliation, maybe even forgiveness. Now she was surrounded, outnumbered, attacked from every side. Tina Brown was there, striking with the crowbar. Brittany, the 16-year-old girl at the center of the feud, added her rage to the storm. Heather Lee, the neighbor, was there too, helping, joining in. 3 against 1. A mother, a daughter, and a neighbor against a 19-year-old girl who had come in with no weapon, no shield, only trust. The cruelty of it is what shakes you. Every blow came from faces she recognized. This wasn't an attack by strangers. These were people she had spoken to, people who shared the same streets, the same community. She thought she knew them. But in that trailer, every strike proved how wrong she was. The stun gun snapped again, paralyzing her body. The crowbar came down, cracking against her skull, her arms, her legs. She tried to fight, but 3 against 1 left no room for defense. Her voice broke into screams that carried down the hallway, through the thin walls, into the night air of the trailer park. Neighbors would later say they heard chaos, but they didn't know what it meant until it was too late. This was different. The blood patterns on the walls, the broken furniture, the marks left by rage told a story no words could fully capture. It wasn't just about taking Audreanna's life. It was about stripping her of dignity, of peace, of mercy. It was about destroying her completely. We all thought of Audreanna's confusion. One moment she is believing reconciliation is possible, and the next she is on the ground, her body convulsing from electricity, her head splitting under the weight of metal, her own voice echoing back at her in screams she can hardly believe are her own. This is not just violence. This is betrayal in its rawest form. What should have been a conversation ended in screams. And still, the cruelty wasn't over, because when they stopped hitting, they weren't finished. They didn't just want her beaten. They wanted her gone in a way that erased her memory. And that leads us to the haunting question. Why stop at beating when the goal was to erase her completely? If it were you, or your daughter, your sister, your friend, what would you have done in those first terrifying seconds? Share your thoughts in the comments, because this isn't just Audreanna's story. It forces us all to face the question, how do you survive when the very people you trust are the ones who turn on you? The beating inside the trailer left Audreanna broken but not gone. Her body was covered in injuries, her skin burned by the stun gun, her bones aching from the blows of the crowbar. Yet somehow she was still alive. 19 years old, she clung to breaths that came shallow, gasping, but still present. She was weak, but she was not finished. The 3 who had attacked her, Tina Brown, her daughter Brittany Miller, and their neighbor Heather Lee, realized this. And to them, it was not enough. They had wanted her to suffer, and they had succeeded. But now, they wanted her gone. It was late. The trailer park quiet, most neighbors unaware of what had just taken place. They needed a way to finish it, a way to make sure no trace of her survival remained. And so they hatched the next step. They would drag her into the woods. Out there, among the trees, there would be no witnesses, no neighbors waking to noise, no chance for her screams to reach another ear. The forest would become the place where the rest of her life would be erased. They lifted her body. She was not light, but with 3 against 1, she was easy enough to carry. She was battered, bloodied, stunned, but she was still breathing. She was aware of what was happening, even as her strength waned. The night air must have felt cold against her skin as they carried her out of the trailer, across the dirt, and into the dark edge of the woods. The gravel crunched under their feet. The night insects buzzed as though nothing was out of place. The world around them was still, silent, and indifferent. The forest stood as the only witness. Gasoline cans were carried in their hands. This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was thought through. They were not just moving her to hide her. They were moving her to burn her. For Tina Brown and her daughter Brittany, it was not enough to beat Audreanna. They wanted her erased completely. They wanted fire to consume her body, to silence her screams, and to remove every trace that she had ever fought back. Heather Lee followed along, complicit, carrying her share of the plan. For Audreanna, each second must have felt like an eternity. Her body was heavy with pain, but her spirit clung to survival. She knew what was happening. She knew where she was being taken. She may have been too weak to break free, but inside she was still holding on. Her mind must have raced. Flashes of her mother's face, her studies, her future, all colliding with the horror of being carried by the very people she had once thought she could face with words, not violence. They reached the clearing. The trees loomed over them, branches swaying slightly in the night air. It was quiet. Too quiet. Out there, no one would see them. No one would hear her. No one would come to help. The woods had become a stage for betrayal. The three attackers stood ready, holding the cans, holding the matches, holding their plan like a script rehearsed too many times. Audreanna lay on the ground, her body failing her, her breath ragged, her eyes searching for mercy that was not there. Detectives would later walk this ground. They would see the charred remains, the burned leaves, the ash scattered across the dirt. They would understand what had happened here, but on that night, only the trees bore witness. And the cruelty of it is that the forest was silent. The trees did not speak. The insects did not cry out. The night simply held what it was given. A young woman fighting for her life, and three people determined to take it away. The gasoline cans were opened. The liquid poured over her body, over the ground, seeping into the dirt, soaking her clothes, filling the air with a sharp, burning stench. She must have felt it, cold against her skin, each drop reminding her of what was coming. In that moment, every ounce of her strength was called on. She screamed. Her body reacted with the last fight she had left. She was not ready to let go. She clung to life with everything inside her, even as fire licked the ground, even as flames reached for her. Even in the middle of unimaginable cruelty, she fought. Her willpower, her screams, her survival instinct. It broke through the night air, carrying across the woods, forcing her story not to vanish, but to be heard. They thought the flames would destroy her story forever, but they underestimated her strength. What would you do at that moment? Would you fight with the last of your strength? Would you beg? Would you pray? Tell us in the comments, because Audreanna's story forces us all to ask, what would survival mean to you if the people you trusted wanted to burn it away? Then came the sound. The strike of a match. A simple flick, small at first, almost nothing against the stillness of the forest. But that small flame became everything. They leaned down, they set the fire, and the flames leapt across the gasoline. In an instant, the night exploded with heat and light. Fire raced up her body, licking across her skin, spreading through her hair, devouring the fabric of her clothes. The sound of fire filled the woods. A low crackle at first, then a roaring hiss as it spread wider, hotter, louder. Mixed with it were the screams. Screams that tore through the quiet. Screams that carried out into the night air. Screams that spoke of agony. Words could never describe. Audreanna was burning, but she was alive, and she screamed for her life. Her body was being destroyed, but her will remained unbroken. She wanted to survive, and in those screams was the sound of survival itself. The fire could not erase her. Her voice carried into the night, carried into the ears of those who would later find her, carried into the case that would expose the people who thought they could burn her story into silence. This was rage, cruelty, and evil set loose. It wasn't just about ending her life. It was about trying to erase her existence. But fire does not erase a will that refuses to be extinguished. They thought she would vanish in smoke. But the story of Audreanna Zimmerman was not finished. And so we are left with the question that drives us into the next chapter. What happens when a victim refuses to stay silent? The fire was meant to end her story, but it did not. Against every odds, against every wound, against the flames that had torn through her body, 19-year-old Audreanna Dawn Zimmerman was still alive. She should not have been. The crowbar blows, the stun gun shocks, the gasoline, the fire, any one of those could have ended her life. But she refused. Even when the flames burned her skin, even when her breath came in shallow gasps, she refused to let go. The forest was dark, the smell of gasoline still clinging to the air. The ground was hot, the dirt and leaves still smoldering where the fire had spread. Her body was burned, her skin blistered, her muscles weak, yet somehow she moved. Inch by inch, breath by breath, she crawled. Her hands pressed against the dirt, dragging herself forward. Her knees scraped against the ground. Her body screamed in pain with every movement, but still, she moved. She would not stay in that clearing. She would not let the woods become her grave. But before she began to crawl, before she pulled her body out of that patch of burning dirt, the attackers made their final choice. Tina Brown, Brittany Miller, and Heather Lee had stood over her as the flames began to spread. They saw her body thrashing, heard her screaming, and still they turned away. They did not run in panic. They did not cry or try to undo what they had done. They walked away with coldness, leaving her in the forest as if she were already dead. To them, her screams were background noise, nothing more than the sound of their anger being completed. They believed the fire would finish her. They believed no one would ever know. They left her broken, burning, and alone in the woods. And that was their mistake. Because the moment their footsteps faded into the night, Audreanna began her fight. The flames had weakened her body, but her spirit refused to give in. She dug her hands into the dirt, dragged her body inch by inch, her breath rattling, her skin raw, her voice breaking with cries of pain. They left her thinking she would vanish in smoke, but instead, she chose survival. She crawled through the underbrush, her body trembling, her skin raw and blistering from the fire. Every inch forward was agony. Her nerves screamed, her breath tore through her throat, her vision blurred, but she did not stop. She could have stayed down, closed her eyes, let the fire and the night take her. But Audreanna chose the harder path. She chose survival. She chose to crawl. She chose to live long enough to tell the truth. Step by step, crawl by crawl, she made her way out of the woods. The silence of the forest gave way to the faint sound of houses, the faint glow of porch lights in the distance. Her body left a trail in the dirt, her skin bleeding, her clothes burned and clinging to her. She stumbled, she fell, she pulled herself up again. She was no longer walking. She was dragging herself forward, her strength running on nothing but sheer willpower. At last, she broke through the tree line. She stumbled into a yard. The neighbor's house stood quiet, but the sight of her body was anything but. Her skin was blackened and peeling, her hair singed, her face swollen with burns. She collapsed in the yard, but still, she moved. Her hand reached out. Her voice, cracked and broken, tried to form words. She wanted to be heard. She wanted someone to know. That someone was Hendrik, a passerby who saw her. He froze at first, shock holding him still as his eyes took in the horror before him. A girl, burned beyond recognition, crawling, dragging herself, her skin still smoking, her voice fighting to escape her throat. For a second, he could not believe what he was seeing. Then instinct took over. He ran toward her, his voice rising in panic as he shouted for help. He dialed for emergency services, his hands shaking, his breath short, his mind unable to process the cruelty he was witnessing. He knelt beside her, his eyes wide, his face pale. He saw the burns, the broken skin, the blood. He heard her voice, faint, broken, but still present. She was trying to speak. She was trying to form words. And in those words was everything. She was not crawling just to live. She was crawling to tell the world what had happened, to make sure the truth was not buried in the ashes the attackers left behind. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the noise, their faces filled with disbelief and horror. They saw Audreanna's body, her skin burned, her frame trembling. Some turned away, unable to look. Others covered their mouths, tears rising in their eyes. Paramedics were called by the rescuer, barely alive, but alive, broken, but not silenced. She had crawled out of hell itself to speak the truth. On one side, her body was failing, her skin torn, her breath shallow, her pain unimaginable. On the other, her spirit was stronger than fire, stronger than the rage that had tried to end her. She defied death to tell her truth. She escaped not just for herself, but for justice, for her mother, for her story to be heard. She escaped the fire, but the fire was already inside her. What would you have done in her place? Would you have found the strength to keep going, or would you have let the fire claim you? Share your thoughts in the comments, because Audreanna's escape is not just her story. It forces all of us to ask how far we would go to survive, and what we'd do if betrayal left us alone in the flames. The ambulance tore through the Florida night, its siren breaking the silence that had settled over the trailer park. Inside, paramedics worked frantically. On the stretcher lay 19-year-old Audreanna Zimmerman, her body a map of burns, bruises, and brokenness. More than 70% of her body was covered in severe burns. Her skin was blistered and peeling, her hair singed away, her eyes swollen, her voice reduced to a rasp. Every breath sounded like it might be her last. But still, she was alive. Against all odds, she had crawled out of the forest, into a neighbor's yard, and into the hands of people who could get her to help. When she arrived at the hospital, staff rushed to her. Doctors and nurses gasped at the sight of her. They had seen burns before, but not like this. Not a body that had been both beaten and set on fire. Not a young woman whose strength had dragged her through the woods after such cruelty. Her vital signs were weak, her blood pressure dropping, her pulse faint. Tubes were inserted, fluids pumped in, monitors attached. The room filled with the steady beeping of machines, the rush of oxygen, the voices of medical staff fighting to keep her alive. The pain must have been unbearable. Burns like hers send pain signals through every nerve, every touch a shock, every movement a scream. Yet, even through that, even as her body failed her, Audreanna found her voice. The detectives who came to her bedside knew they could not wait. Time was against them. They had to ask her what happened, who did this, before the fire inside her body took away her last chance to speak. She whispered. Her voice was broken, hoarse, barely audible, but it carried everything. She said the names. First, Tina Brown. Then, Heather. Then, Brittany. The words cracked through the room, quiet but undeniable. There was no hesitation, no confusion. She knew exactly who had done this to her. The same people who had lured her into the trailer. The same people who had beaten her, dragged her into the woods, poured gasoline, and lit the fire. With her dying strength, she named them. Detectives froze for a moment, the weight of those words sinking in. They had been bracing themselves for vague answers, for fragments of memory clouded by trauma. Instead, they received clarity. 3 names, 3 suspects. A mother, her 16-year-old daughter, and their neighbor. It was enough to build the foundation of the case, enough to turn suspicion into certainty, enough to give the investigation a voice that could not be ignored. And that is the emotional contrast at the heart of this chapter. On one side were the attackers, people who believed their lies and silence would protect them. They had walked away from the fire believing the flames would erase every trace of what they had done. On the other side was Audreanna, her body destroyed, her life hanging by a thread, yet her whisper carried more weight than their lies ever could. One whisper from a hospital bed was stronger than 3 people's attempts to cover up the truth. The detectives leaned in, making sure they heard correctly. They wrote the names down. They repeated them back to her, gently, to confirm. And with her faint nods, her rasping words, she confirmed it again. There was no mistake. Tina. Heather. Brittany. These were the names she wanted the world to remember. These were the names she wanted tied to her story. Her testimony became the backbone of the investigation. Prosecutors would later build their case on it. Neighbors' suspicions, forensic evidence, witness statements, all of it mattered. But it was Audreanna's voice that gave it shape. It was her testimony that cut through the noise and put the spotlight squarely on the three who thought they had erased her. Her voice, broken and fading, became the strongest piece of evidence in the entire case. Imagine the courage that took. Lying in a hospital bed, her skin burning from within, her body exhausted, her voice nearly gone, and still she spoke. Still she fought. Still she gave detectives the truth. Her body was failing, but her voice carried power. That power now belonged to the investigation, to her family, to the justice system that would try to right what could never truly be made right. Her body was failing, but her voice carried power. And now we ask the question that must carry us forward. Would justice honor her last words? Those words spoken by 19-year-old Audreanna Reed Zimmerman from her hospital bed carried more weight than anyone could have imagined. Tina Brown, Heather Lee, Brittany Miller. Those were the names she whispered with the last of her strength. And with those names, detectives had a roadmap. The investigation moved quickly. Warrants were prepared. Officers spread through the community. Within hours, the law closed in on the three people Audreanna had identified. The first to be arrested was Tina Brown. Detectives arrived at her trailer, the same trailer where she had lured Audreanna in with a false promise of reconciliation. The same trailer where the ambush began with a crackling stun gun and the swing of a crowbar. Tina was a mother, but when officers placed her in handcuffs, there was no sign of the compassion or protection that role should have carried. Neighbors watched from behind blinds, their faces pale with disbelief. It wasn't a stranger being taken away. It was someone they had lived beside for years, someone who had sat on porches, someone they had spoken to about everyday life. Now she was being led away as a suspect in one of the most brutal crimes the community had ever seen. The second arrest came swiftly. 16-year-old Brittany Miller, Tina's daughter, was pulled from the same home. To many in the community, she was still a child, still someone who should have been in school, not in shackles. But Audreanna had named her. Witnesses had placed her there, and detectives had no doubt she had been part of the violence. The image of a teenager being led away in handcuffs burned itself into the memory of the community. Mothers gasped. Fathers shook their heads. They saw not just a suspect, but a child accused of cruelty so deliberate it was hard to comprehend. Heather Lee was the third. The neighbor who had stood beside Tina and Brittany in the plot, who had chosen loyalty to them over what was right. She was arrested in the same park, taken from her home only a short walk from where Audreanna had lived. For residents, this was another blow. It wasn't just a mother and daughter. It was a neighbor. Someone they saw at the mailbox. Someone who waved when walking past. Someone who was part of the rhythm of everyday life. Now she too was in handcuffs. The weight of these arrests rippled through the community like a shockwave. Neighbors whispered to each other, their voices heavy with disbelief. How could this have happened? How could people they knew, a mother, her daughter, and their friend, do something so monstrous? It wasn't strangers hiding in the dark who had attacked Audreanna. It was people who shared the same streets, the same air, the same days. And that betrayal cut deeper than the crime itself. For Audreanna's family, the arrests were both relief and agony. Relief, because the names she had spoken were being taken seriously, because justice was moving, because the attackers would not walk free. Agony, because no arrest could undo the pain. No handcuffs could erase the sight of their daughter burned and broken in a hospital bed. They wanted answers, but every answer only brought more questions. How could three people look at a 19-year-old girl and decide her life was disposable? How could a mother lead her own child into violence like that? The emotional pull of this moment gripped everyone. Families across the trailer park, across the town, felt torn. Parents looked at their own children and wondered how someone so young, just 16, could have been part of something so cruel. Neighbors looked at Tina Brown and asked themselves how a mother, the person meant to protect, could become the leader of such savagery. And everyone looked at Heather Lee and asked how a neighbor could watch it unfold and choose complicity over conscience. Police vehicles lined the streets that night. Flashing lights cut through the darkness. The sound of doors slamming, radios crackling, officers walking suspects to waiting cars. These were the sounds of justice beginning. And yet, for the community, they were also the sounds of heartbreak. Because the people in those cars were not faceless criminals, they were neighbors, familiar voices, people who had once seemed ordinary. The faces of her killers were not strangers in the dark. They were neighbors in the light. And now comes the question that weighs heavy on everyone. What punishment fits cruelty this deliberate? The arrests brought the community some measure of relief, but relief was not justice. The names had been spoken, the suspects had been identified, but the courtroom would decide what came next. For Audreanna's family, every hearing, every legal motion, every appearance in front of a judge felt like reopening the wound. They had to sit in a room with the people who had beaten, burned, and left their daughter for dead. They had to hear the crime retold in detail, every moment of her suffering laid bare for strangers to weigh. On November 3rd, 2011, when the trial began, one of the three made a decision that changed everything. Heather Lee, the neighbor who had stood by Tina Brown and Brittany Miller on the night of March 24th, took a plea deal. She agreed to testify against them in exchange for a lighter sentence. For the prosecution, this was crucial. Heather could give the jury the inside story. She could take them step by step through the plan, the ambush, the fire. She could confirm what Audreanna had whispered from her hospital bed with her last strength. When Heather walked into the courtroom, the eyes of the jury followed her. Here was a woman who had been part of it, who had stood by as a 19-year-old girl screamed in flames. And now she was the one speaking. The prosecutor led her through the questions carefully. Did Tina Brown lure Audreanna into the trailer? Yes. Did Brittany Miller take part in the attack? Yes. Did Tina strike her with a crowbar? Yes. Did they drag her into the woods, douse her in gasoline, and set her on fire? Heather's answer was quiet, but it carried across the room. Yes. The courtroom fell silent at her words. Even though the details were already in the police reports, even though the jury had been told what happened, hearing it from the mouth of someone who was there made it different. Heather described the crackle of the stun gun, the swing of the crowbar, the smell of gasoline, the sound of flames catching, and Audreanna's screams. She told the jury what it looked like when the three of them stood over her, what it sounded like when Audreanna fought through the fire, what it felt like when they walked away and left her there. Audreanna's family sat in the courtroom, their faces heavy with grief. They had known the broad strokes of what happened, but hearing it described in this detail was like living it all over again. Some wept quietly. Others sat frozen, their fists clenched, their eyes locked on the women sitting at the defense table. The pain was unbearable, but they listened. They had to, because these words, however hard to hear, were the foundation of justice. On the witness stand was Heather Lee, a woman who survived because she betrayed Audreanna, because she stood with Tina and Brittany instead of stopping them. She lived. She was speaking. She was telling her story. And on the other side was Audreanna, who was not there, who could never sit in that courtroom, who could never speak for herself again, except through the words she whispered before she died. Heather lived as a co-conspirator. Audreanna died as the victim. That contrast weighed on everyone in the room. The prosecutor drove the point home to the jury. This was not a crime of passion, not a moment of lost control. It was planned. Tina Brown invited Audreanna into her trailer under false pretenses. She had help. Her daughter was part of it. Her neighbor stood with her. Together they ambushed her. Together they dragged her into the woods. Together they poured gasoline and lit the match. And together they walked away. Every detail Heather Lee gave reinforced the deliberate nature of the crime. The defense tried to fight back. They questioned Heather's credibility, pointing out her plea deal, suggesting she was only testifying to save herself. They asked whether she exaggerated details, whether her memory was reliable. But even as they tried to undermine her, The damage was done. The jury had heard enough. And the prosecution reminded them. Audreanna herself had spoken before she died. Her words matched Heather's. Tina, Heather, Brittany. The victim and the accomplice had told the same story. For days, the courtroom heard more evidence. Forensic experts described the burns, the gasoline residue, the pattern of injuries that matched crowbar strikes. Neighbors testified to hearing screams in the night. First responders described finding her in the yard, burned, crawling, still alive. Every piece fit together. Every voice carried the same truth. By the time the closing arguments came, the jury knew the story by heart. They knew what had been done, and who had done it. The truth was now undeniable. But justice had yet to be decided. And the question that lingered over the courtroom, over the community, over everyone who followed the case was this: would the system show mercy to those who showed none? The trial had laid the truth bare. The jury had heard the screams through testimony, seen the photographs, listened to the medical experts, and watched as Heather Lee told them what happened on the night of March 24, 2010. They heard how Tina Brown had lured Audreanna into her trailer, how Brittany Miller joined her mother in the ambush, and how Heather helped carry out the plan. They heard how gasoline had been poured, how a match had been struck, how a young woman was left burning in the woods, and they heard how, with her last strength, Audreanna had spoken the names that would bring all three of them into that courtroom. Now it was time for judgment. The first sentence was for Tina Brown. She stood before the court. She was no longer the loud neighbor who had once spoken with confidence in the trailer park. She was no longer the mother who led her daughter into violence. She was a convicted murderer facing the ultimate punishment. The judge's words cut through the courtroom. Death. Tina Brown was sentenced to die for the murder of 19-year-old Audreanna Zimmerman. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read. For Audreanna's family, it was justice, but not relief. The woman who had taken their daughter's life would pay with her own, but their daughter would not come back. Next came Brittany Miller. She was only 16 when the crime was committed. In another world, she might have been finishing high school, looking toward her future, still shielded by youth. But in this courtroom, there was no shield. The jury and judge agreed. She had taken part in the ambush, the dragging, the fire. She was not a bystander. She was not just a child swept up in her mother's rage. She was an active participant in cruelty. The court decided she would be tried as an adult, and when her sentence came, it was life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 16, her life outside prison walls ended. The image of Brittany hearing that sentence was unforgettable. A teenager, her face pale, her hands trembling, sitting beside attorneys who could not save her. Some in the community struggled with it. The sight of someone so young condemned to spend the rest of her life in a cage. But then they remembered Audreanna, who was also young, who had her life taken violently, who had no second chances. For many, the sentence was not harsh. It was fair. A life for a life. On July 20th, 2012, the last sentence went in for Heather Lee. Unlike Tina and Brittany, Heather had taken a plea deal, admitting her role in exchange for cooperation with prosecutors. Her testimony had been crucial in securing the convictions. Without her words, the defense might have cast more doubt. The jury might have hesitated. But her involvement could not be erased. She had helped. She had stood by when the fire was lit. For her, the court delivered 25 years in prison. She would serve her time knowing she had chosen complicity over conscience, knowing she had saved herself at the cost of standing by while a 19-year-old girl was burned alive. The contrast was striking. On one side, Audreanna's life had been stripped away, her future stolen, her dreams of becoming a nurse silenced forever. On the other side, the guilty had their sentences written in ink. Tina Brown would die by the state's hand. Brittany Miller would live behind bars until her final breath. Heather Lee would live out decades of her life confined in a cell, counting years instead of memories. Justice had been delivered, but it did not feel like balance. The punishment was heavy, but the grief remained heavier. For the family, every sentence carried weight, but also emptiness. They sat in the courtroom, listening to the judge's words. their eyes filled with tears, their hearts filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that the killers would never walk free again. Sorrow because no sentence could bring back the 19-year-old girl who once laughed in their kitchen, who once studied late into the night with nursing textbooks open, who once promised her mother she would make her proud. The sentences closed a chapter, but they did not close the wound. For the community, the outrage lingered. These were not strangers who had come into the neighborhood. These were familiar faces. A mother, her daughter, and a neighbor. People they had greeted in passing. People they had lived alongside for years. Now they were branded murderers, their names tied forever to cruelty. The betrayal cut deep. Neighbors shook their heads, still unable to believe how close evil had lived to them. The sentencing brought justice, but it also brought a sobering truth. Sometimes, the greatest danger comes from the people right beside us. Justice was written in sentences, but grief was written in every tear. Does punishment ever balance the scale when cruelty burns this deep? The trial ended. The sentences were handed down. Tina Brown, the mother who led her daughter and neighbor into violence, was condemned to death. In 2012, she became one of the few women sentenced to die in the state of Florida. Today, she remains on Florida's death row, the only woman still awaiting execution there. Her days are measured not in freedom, but in time. Her cell a constant reminder of the crime she chose to commit. She lives in the shadow of a sentence she cannot escape. Brittany Miller, just 16 at the time of the crime, was tried as an adult. She appealed her conviction, hoping her youth would bring leniency, hoping a higher court would see her differently. But the appeals were rejected. Every judge who reviewed her case upheld the decision. She was guilty, and she would remain in prison for life without the possibility of parole. For her, adulthood came behind concrete walls and steel doors. The rest of her life is locked away. Heather Lee, who took a plea deal in exchange for her testimony, was given 25 years. She sits in prison serving her time, counting the days until release. Unlike Tina and Brittany, she may one day step outside again. But even when she does, her name will always carry the weight of this crime. She was the neighbor who stood by, the neighbor who helped, the neighbor who chose complicity instead of conscience. 25 years cannot erase that. For the justice system, the story was closed. The killers were sentenced, the verdicts final, the appeals exhausted. But for Audreanna's family, there was no closing. There was no end. The courtroom could not return her laughter to their home, could not place her back at the kitchen table, could not give her mother back the future she had dreamed of for her only daughter. Every birthday past became a reminder of what had been stolen. Every holiday, every family gathering, every milestone carried her absence like a shadow. In the community, the grief was just as heavy. Neighbors who once lived side by side with Tina Brown, who once waved to Heather Lee, who once saw Brittany as just another teenager, still carried the weight of betrayal. They had not attacked themselves, but their trust had been shattered. They now looked at every familiar face differently, knowing the truth. Sometimes the greatest dangers are not strangers, but neighbors. Yet through all the grief, through all the pain, Audreanna's memory became more than tragedy. For her family, remembering her was an act of resistance. They spoke of her laughter, her kindness, her dream of becoming a nurse, her gentle way of caring for others. They wanted the world to remember her not as the girl who was burned alive, but as the girl who had the courage to survive long enough to tell the truth. They refused to let violence erase her. Her killers tried to erase her with fire, to silence her with cruelty. But her family and community hold on to her memory, speaking her name, keeping her alive in stories, in photographs, in the legacy of her courage. Violence tried to erase. Memory resists. The killers are remembered for their cruelty. She is remembered for her courage. Her killers are remembered for their cruelty. She is remembered for her courage. What does her story demand of us? As viewers, citizens, human beings. Audreanna Zimmerman endured a cruelty detectives said they had never seen before. She was stunned, beaten, dragged, burned. Yet even through the flames, she found the strength to speak. Her testimony turned fire into truth, her whispers into evidence, her pain into justice. With her last words, She named the people who tried to silence her. She transformed her suffering into the foundation of the case that brought them down. Today, her killers live in cages. Tina Brown sits on death row, waiting for the state to decide when her final day will come. Brittany Miller, who was still a teenager when she joined the attack, will spend her life behind bars with no chance of parole. Heather Lee will serve 25 years before she can ever walk free again. But none of their punishments return what was stolen. None of their sentences bring back the life of a 19-year-old girl whose dreams ended in a forest clearing. And that is where we are left. Justice punishes the guilty, but what do we owe the memory of the innocent? Audreanna's name burns brighter than their hatred ever could. Her courage, her willpower, her voice. Those are the things that remain. They remind us that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, truth can survive, and memory can outlast violence. So we leave you with the question that lingers long after the verdicts and the sentences. Do you believe justice was truly served? Or does this case show us that no punishment, no sentence, no verdict can ever equal a life stolen? Tell us in the comments what you think, because your voice honors her memory just as much as her last words did. And if you believe Audreanna's story should never be forgotten, make sure to like this video, share it so others know her name, and subscribe so we can continue telling the stories of those whose voices were nearly silenced.